A chill of stark terror runs along the spines of even the toughest of gangsters and criminals dwelling in the Badlands of New York. Whenever the name of the dreaded Master of Darkness, the Shadow, is mentioned, it is no different for a close-knit family of killers bent on perpetrating a reign of terror upon the innocent until they incur the righteous wrath of the Shadow. Greetings, and welcome to a special, extra information-filled edition of the DC Comics Silver and Bronze Age podcast. As per usual, I'm your congenial host Larry, and I'll be your intrepid guide as we delve into DC Comics' past, and together we'll thrill to the adventures of your favorite DC Comics superheroes. The reason I say that today's edition of the podcast is special, dear listeners, is that we'll be taking some time looking into the history of the Cloaked Avenger of the Night, the Shadow. I'll give you all fine folks listening to this some fair warning. This is going to be somewhat lengthy, so grab yourself a drink, fill up a bowl of popcorn or potato chips, settle in and relax as the legendary story of the Shadow unfolds. Dear listeners, you could assume, perhaps rightly so, that this episode is in part a detailed retrospective of the Shadow himself, and not just an analysis of a certain issue of a series he starred in. The Master of Darkness was not a creation of DC Comics itself, but had been licensed to the comic company for a small number of series over the course of DC Comics' Bronze Age. Indeed, the Shadow, it has been stated on numerous occasions, has been a compelling inspiration for the transformation of the Caped Crusader himself, Batman. The Shadow has had quite an extensive history in entertainment media, thrilling generations with his exploits not only in pulp magazines and on radio, but also in comic strips, comic books, on various movie adaptations, and appearing on various merchandise over decades. The Cloaked Avenger of the Night has had a strange yet intriguing evolution into becoming the pop culture icon he became over subsequent decades. Albeit a somewhat convoluted timeline is involved, so I suppose we can always begin at the beginning and take things from there. Originally, the Shadow did not start off directly as the hero of his own pulp magazine, nor was he the star of his own radio program. In fact, he sprang into eerie existence as a disembodied voice with a spooky, knowing laugh that chilled radio audiences who heard it. On July 31st, 1930, the Shadow made his startling debut as a mysterious narrator for the radio program The Detective Story Hour, created specifically to help increase declining sales for Street and Smith Publications' Detective Story magazine. Oh, as a quick side note, the legendary lines of dialogue, "Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men, the Shadow knows," followed quickly by that eerie laugh, comes directly from the introduction of that radio program. Now, folks, if you'll pardon me for indulging in a moment here, I'm going to try to see if I can imitate that introduction that was heard on the radio many, many decades ago. So just please bear with me for a second here. Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The Shadow knows. Well, I tried, folks. Well, at any rate, let's get on with the program here. Keep the magazine firm Street and Smith in mind, folks, as we move along, because that publishing company will play a huge part in shaping the future of the Shadow coming up shortly. In response to growing demand by the listening audience of the Detective Story Hour, who wanted to read of the mysterious narrator, the Shadow, Street and Smith's management tasked prolific writer and talented stage magician Walter B. Gibson, using the company pen name of Maxwell Grant, to develop the premise of the Shadow into a distinctive literary character. It was Gibson who created all of the mythos and characterization of the Shadow, including one of his frequent alter egos he used in his relentless war on crime, that of wealthy playboy Lamont Cranston. The Shadow made his first appearance in print in his own magazine, published twice a month, titled The Shadow Magazine, on April the 1st, 1931, with the first story titled The Living Shadow, and thus a legend was born. For the purposes of completion with regard to the Shadow's history, we'll take a moment to talk about the famous radio program. The opening episode of the show was broadcast on September 26th, 1937, voiced for the first few years of the program by none other than the dynamic young playwright and radio personality Orson Welles. On the show, the Shadow was given the power to cloud men's minds so that they cannot see him. In the literary version, however, the Shadow does not possess that ability. He simply and effortlessly blends into the darkness of inky shadows, imitating invisibility to avoid detection. You might be asking, dear listeners, are there really two distinct versions of the Shadow? For entertainment purposes, yes, there was, and that often led to confusion about the Shadow's true identity, since he was regarded as Lamont Cranston on the radio show, and in the pulp magazine stories, Lamont Cranston was one of the Shadow's various alter egos. So, who really is the Shadow? To answer that question, we'll deal with what the print version of the character has established and what eventually DC Comics used as part of their series of comics. The Shadow's real name was Kent Allard, famed aviator known by the nickname of the Black Eagle, also using the name of the Dark Eagle during World War I. After the Great War, Allard used his resources to falsify his death in the South American jungles, then re-emerged in the United States to make his main headquarters in New York City, assuming various identities to conceal his existence from the public and from the legions of the underworld, with whom he would wage an unending war. One of the alter egos Allard would assume was bored millionaire and world traveler Lamont Cranston. In the pulps, Cranston was a separate character. Allard would frequently assume Cranston's identity while the millionaire was away on his various trips abroad, leaving Allard with the freedom of additional wealth, prestige, and influence he could use in his war against crime. The Shadow would even adopt the disguise of an old, doddering, and slow-witted janitor named Fritz, who worked at police headquarters in order to listen in on conversations by authorities as well as examine crucial evidence. Gibson's written rendering of the Master of Darkness placed the fundamentals for what would become the superhero archetype and became the creative spark for countless heroes for many comic book companies, including DC Comics, chiefly among them Batman himself. The overall attire of the Shadow remained the same throughout his crime-fighting career, mainly put together through the pulp stories, and endures as the definitive mode of outfit for variations in form for pulp heroes ever since. Dressed in black, he wore a wide-brimmed slouch hat and a crimson-lined cloak with the collar turned up to obscure his face. In the 40s comics and later comic series and the 1994 film, a crimson scarf was wrapped underneath his nose and across his mouth and chin. According to the narratives of the pulp stories, and depicted starkly in the Bronze Age comics, only the Shadow's eyes would be visible to many evildoers and to those few innocent citizens who met him. The eyes of the Shadow blazed with unbidden fury, intimidating any gangster and criminal who dared to prey upon the innocent. Other features of the pulp crime fighter, which gained renown over subsequent decades, was his unique fire opal or garrisol ring, as well as the ever-present twin .45 automatic pistols, with which the Shadow would cut down the ruthless denizens of the underworld. Another famous aspect of the Shadow in terms of his literary exploits was his network of numerous agents who assist him in his relentless war on crime. Among the most famous of his agents in the pulps were Harry Vincent, a young man whom the Shadow once saved from suicide, Clyde Burke, a newspaper reporter, Cliff Marsland, an ex-con and underworld figure, Mo Shrevnitz, a cab driver, Rutledge Mann, a stockbroker who collects information, Burbank, the Shadow's stalwart contact man, and finally Margot Lane, a courageous socialite made for the radio show and was introduced into the pulp stories later on. Well, so much for the Shadow's retrospective. Now on to the issue at hand for today. The Shadow issue number 10 from May of 1975, titled The Night of the Killers, was written by Dennis O'Neil. The interior art, both pencils and inks, was performed by E.R. Cruz, and the editor for the series was Dennis O'Neil. Somewhere in the Midwest, a small number of the Shadow's agents are in the pursuit of a ruthless gang of robbers and killers called the Papa Crouch Gang. The Master of Darkness is also upon their trail. During a holdup by the infamous gang, Mo Shrevnitz is seriously wounded and Harry Vincent races to bring him to a hospital. The Shadow meets with Margot Lane, Vincent, and their contact agent Burbank to inform them of his next strategy in his campaign against the Papa Crouch gang. The Shadow travels back to New York to speak with an older brother of the Crouch family, but before any further vital information can be gained, the brother is killed by one of the members of the gang, who is himself subsequently killed. Meanwhile, Margot Lane talks with Sheriff Clum about the recent holdup perpetrated by the Papa Crouch gang. The hostile lawman is not interested in speaking nor divulging any information to Margot. Just then, Judge Blaney, who was kidnapped earlier by the gang, enters the sheriff's office to tell him that the gang is still on the loose. The sheriff, Judge Blaney, and a few other trigger-happy men go off to track down the Crouches, as Margot meets with the Shadow once again. They go off in the Shadow's autogyro and blast a bridge using bombs to prevent Sheriff Clum and his posse in tracking down the Crouch family and killing them outright. The Shadow stalks the rest of the killer family, engaging in a gun battle where both the father and younger brother are killed, leaving the brother's wife left wounded but alive. The judge and the sheriff come upon the scene, and the wife of the dead Crouch brother reveals to one and all present that Judge Blaney was responsible for the gang's recent crimes, with their leader Papa Crouch owing the judge a favor for having Crouch released from prison. The corrupt judge tries to flee in panic in a stolen car, knowing that his evil schemes were crashing down around him, thanks to the female gang member's confession. He races to the destroyed bridge, forgetting that it was bombed moments earlier, while the Master of Darkness goes after him in his autogyro, and the judge races off the remaining ruined end of the bridge, crashing to a fiery death. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we reach the point in the show where we'll take a look at the notable events from May of 1975. May the 1st, under pressure from the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, the New York Stock Exchange drops the requirement of a fixed commission for stock transactions. Free to vary their rates, brokerage houses could compete for large investors by offering a lower charge than that for individuals. Also on that day, Hank Aaron broke the career record for RBI's runs batted in when his Milwaukee Brewers beat the Detroit Tigers 17-3. Aaron, who had already broken Babe Ruth's career home run record, surpassed Ruth's RBI mark with the 2,210th RBI. Aaron's record of 2,297 RBIs remains unbroken. May the 3rd, in his last meeting of the Politburo of the Chinese Communist Party, Chairman Mao Zedong spoke out to reverse the disastrous Cultural Revolution. Also on that day, the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz, first of the Nimitz-class group of the 10 largest supercarriers in the world, was commissioned. Brad Elward, Nimitz-class aircraft carriers. And also, the city of Jerusalem was struck by missiles for the first time after 2 Czechoslovakian-made Katyusha rockets fired by Arab guerrillas struck 500 meters from the Knesset Parliament building. On May the 5th, the first time since the founding of Social Security in the United States, the Social Security Administration announced the retirement and disability program was in debt, and that its $46 billion reserve would be drained by 1983. On May the 7th, U.S. President Ford proclaimed the end of the Vietnam era for purposes of certain veterans' benefits. Under Title 38 of the United States Code, the era is now defined as the period beginning on February the 28th, 1961, and ending on May the 7th, 1975, in the case of a veteran who served in the Republic of Vietnam during that period. On May the 8th, the People's Republic of China agreed to establish trade and diplomatic relations with the European Community, agreeing to send a representative to Common Market headquarters in Brussels. On May the 10th, the Betamax home videotaping system was introduced by Sony, with the LV-1901 going on sale in Japan. The unit, which contained a color TV, the recorder, and the tapes, retailed for $2,488. Also on that day, Darrell Waltrip won his first national NASCAR race in his 4th season of competition in the Music City 420 in Nashville. Waltrip would go on to win 3 NASCAR championships in 1981, 1982, and 1985. On May the 11th, a crowd of about 17,000 people in New York City's Central Park celebrated the end of the Vietnam War. Organized by Phil Ochs, the rally included such music performances by Bob Dylan, Pete Seeger, Joan Baez, and Paul Simon. On May the 16th, Junko Tabai, a 35-year-old homemaker from Japan, became the first woman to reach the top of Mount Everest, arriving at the summit 29,028 feet above sea level at 12:30 p.m. local time. May the 17th, the wild man of the Green Swamp in Florida was captured by sheriff's deputies in Sumter County, Florida, after surviving on his own for 8 months. First sighted in September, he had eaten armadillos, snakes, turtles, and alligators. Identified as Hu Tu-mei of Taiwan, a mentally ill man who had escaped from a Tampa hospital, the wild man hanged himself in jail 2 days later. On May the 20th, the U.S. House of Representatives voted 303 to 96 to admit women to the previously all-male service academies at West Point, Annapolis, and Colorado Springs. On May the 24th, the last naturally occurring case of the smallpox virus, variola major, was found on a woman named Saiban Bibi, who was found ill at a railway station in Karamanj in the Assam state of India. The last case of variola minor would be found in Somalia at Merka in October of 1977. Also on that day, the Soviet space mission Soyuz 18 was launched into space with Pyotr Klimuk and Vitaly Sevastyanov on board. The next day, the cosmonauts docked with the Salyut 4 space station. On May the 30th, for the first time in 8 years, the Suez Canal became navigable once more. After the last 2 trapped ships, the British freighters Scottish Star and Port Invercargill, were towed 60 miles from the Great Bitter Lake to Port Said. The canal would officially reopen on June the 5th. And on the last day of the month, May the 31st, communist Pathet Lao troops took control of Savannakhet, the second largest city in Laos, as Laotian Prime Minister Suvarna Phuma ordered the Royal Army to lay down their arms and cease further resistance. Now, on the entertainment front, 1975 became a significant year which laid the foundations for what would eventually become the blockbuster movie phenomenon that would become a money-making trend into the rest of the 70s and into the 80s. An important event also in May of 1975 was George Lucas's creation of his visual effects company, Industrial Light and Magic. Also, in November of 1975, Sneak Previews, the first American film review show, premieres and launches the careers of film critics Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert. They will remain a team and a staple among film critics through various programs for the next 24 years. I'm sure most of you listeners will recognize some of the classics I'll be mentioning in the top grossing list for the year 1975. So starting in descending order along the way up to the number 1 spot for the top films of that year, we have number 10, The Other Side of the Mountain from Universal, number 9, Aloha, Bobby and Rose from Columbia, number 8, The Apple Dumpling Gang from Disney Pictures, number 7, Funny Lady from Columbia, number 6, The Return of the Pink Panther from United Artists, number 5, Shampoo from Columbia, number 4, Dog Day Afternoon from Warner Brothers, number 3, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest from United Artists. Number 2, The Rocky Horror Picture Show from 20th Century Fox. And the number 1 box office smash hit of the year 1975 goes to the blockbuster film of the decade, perhaps of all time. The thriller film based upon the novel by Peter Benchley, published in 1974, directed by Steven Spielberg, considered one of the greatest films ever made, and that would be Jaws. Right now, we'll also take a look at the top singles on the pop music charts for 1975. So according to Billboard magazine, from descending order, we have number 10, Glenn Campbell with Rhinestone Cowboy, number 9, Silver Convention with Fly Robin Fly, number 8, The Carpenters with Please Mr. Postman, number 7, George Baker Selection with Una Paloma Blanca, number 6, The Sweet with Fox on the Run, number 5, Patti LaBelle with Lady Marmalade. Number 4, The Captain and Tennille with Love Will Keep Us Together. Number 3, 10cc with I'm Not in Love. Number 2, ABBA with SOS. And the number 1 hit single for the year 1975, according to Billboard magazine, that came from this mainly country music singer-songwriter who worked with the likes of Conway Twitty, Waylon Jennings, and Mel Tillis, before going on to becoming bass guitarist for Chris Christopherson. So the number 1 spot goes to Billy Swan with the song I Can Help. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I have to offer a profound and sincere thank you to those who have remained with me to the end of this episode, and I once again thank you very much for your patience and your cooperation, and I think that this episode was well worth your time. Now, before we say goodbye, I'd like to thank everybody who listened to this, and I also invite you to stick around with me once again as we continue this podcast. If you would be so kind, please like and subscribe to this channel for more episodes, and if you have any comments or suggestions, then please feel free to post them in the comments section below. It would be greatly appreciated. So until next time, everyone, this is Larry, aka the Charming Curmudgeon. So long for now.